The labor system that's existed in Qatar and across the Gulf for many years is called the kafala system. And what that system means is that you have any foreigner who's within the country, their visa is tied to their employer. You cannot switch jobs without asking your employer. You cannot leave the country without asking your employer. Your employer, in many respects, controls your destiny. And if you don't have a fair employer, they can very easily exploit that situation. And that carries with it, has carried with it some real human rights abuses, where people have some of the housing that's been given to them, they haven't had windows. They've been sharing their room with 12, 15 other roommates. They're working at least 12-hour days in terrible heat in the summertime. And then, of course, if they ever wanted to get out of that situation, there's really no escape because their employer would be the person who would have to kind of grant them the permission. That's what a lot of the media has focused on, and I think somewhat rightfully so. It's really difficult to put any sort of face on the worker for the reasons that I mentioned before. It's because you often have to work undercover, or you have to hide people's identity. How can you empathize with somebody when you kind of strip them of their humanity? We always set out to make this film in a way that it wasn't going to be an expose. Our goal with this film was to tell a story that would sensitize workers. Our characters were always talking about how they felt isolated from society because labor camps, by regulation, are located far away from kind of major residential areas. They're kind of kept out, 50 kilometers or so from the city, and there's really no mode of transportation to get into the city then. They're cut off from society, and now they're cut off from their families and their friends. Also, their passports, normally taken away from them so that they can't go home unless they go to their employer and request their passport. So all of that kind of leads to a lot of psychological duress. And that's what we really tried to focus on about, not just kind of the health and the safety concerns that workers live under, but also how that kind of psychological duress just strips them of their humanity, and it strips them of the very motivation that brought them to the country to begin with. And they end up feeling more like a machine. Suicide, not so much, because suicide is really taboo, and for most people from that part of the world. But certainly, people, you can see in the film through the scene that you reference that people went to really dramatic measures to go home. What I found most interesting about that scene in particular, where somebody kind of attacks their roommate just so that, they're arrested and then deported, because they don't know how else to access even a means of leaving. That requires a great leap of logic that I think people in a normal mental state wouldn't make. This system predates the World Cup, by decades. It's just that people didn't really know about it or care about it until Qatar became the host of the 2022 World Cup. And so, I think that means that the World Cup brings with it a window of opportunity to change the labor system for the better, because people do suddenly really care about this issue. Generally, we would have no influence whatsoever on the labor system in Qatar. But when you take on these major international sporting events that bring everyone together, suddenly all of us have a voice in what's going on. Certainly the World Cup, the Olympics, they are by and large profitable due to major sponsorships. People have voiced their opinion to those sponsors, and that has created, I think, enough noise to kind of kick FIFA into high gear in certain cases. As a consumer, you can be aware of kind of who is sponsoring these events, and you can voice your opinion directly to them through. Social media is amazing for that now. Certainly, you can express your opinion through how you spend your money. Your capital is very powerful in that regard. I think as well, it's important that when these global events happen, and suddenly we're thinking about the global inequities that exist, it's important to reflect on how those also are borne out kind of closer to home. For people, whether it's in the U.S. or whether it's people in Japan. I hope that people reflect on the situations that are happening closer to their own lives, where perhaps they can make even a greater difference.